everyone, and thank you for attending today's meeting. This is our May DAQAA meeting for members. Today we have Kent McDonald presenting for us. Just a couple of things to note. Next month we will be having a in-person social event on the 29th of June. It'll be from 4 to 6, location to be determined yet. So we will put that out once we know where we're going to have it at, and hopefully it'll be a nice day and not 100 degrees out, and everybody can come out and actually see people face to face and talk and socialize. And but again, that'll be the 29th of June, and so once we figure out where we're going to have it, we'll let everybody know. And like Dusty mentioned earlier, if you weren't on, this will be is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. Probably tomorrow. So, Kent, if you have anything, if you want, we can keep track of the chat, or if you want people to just chime in with questions, you're just however you want that to go. And I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, if you could keep track of the chat, that would be good, because I'm going to bring up some slides here, and so I may not be able to see the chat. So let me bring my slides up. All right, everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Good deal. Okay, well, thanks again for having me here today. Brief introduction as to why I'm talking about this kind of stuff. So my name's Kent McDonald, have been a resident, born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, with a short stints in other places. Have spent most of my career doing some sort of product-y stuff, starting out in a more traditional business analyst type role, doing some agile coaching, and then the last few years have been doing product ownership and product management for a variety of different organizations. One of the things, though, that's been pretty consistent throughout all of that is that my stint and role as a product person has quite often extended into stuff that would normally be considered testing and quality assurance. So one of the things that I always try and do when I'm working with teams and working as part of a team is to figure out how to best make sure that everyone's on the same page and has a shared understanding about what we're trying to build from early on as possible. And so through the course of trying to come up with ways to do that, I came across the particular technique that I'm going to talk about today, which is example mapping. And so as I talk through this, you may note that it has a little bit of a flair for the people that are describing what it is you're trying to do. But the important thing is that a key factor in making this work is that people from a variety of different perspectives are working together to make it happen. So I'm a big believer in bringing up consideration of how you're going to make sure this thing's working as early on as possible. So the faster you can actually have real life examples that you're talking about, the better off you're going to be. So with that in mind, I want to talk through how to build shared understanding with a technique called example mapping. So the first thing I kind of want to look at is, why do you talk about examples? From a standpoint of being someone that's trying to describe, here's the problem we're trying to solve, and here's how we might go about doing it. I inevitably find myself, when I'm talking to customers or users or stakeholders, and they're explaining some very arcane or very strange business logic, I inevitably say, well, could you give me an example about that? For a couple of reasons. One, because oftentimes when people are describing something off the cuff, they may not be necessarily using the most precise terms. Other times they might be talking about a scenario that they make it sounds like happens all the time, but it's a very rare occurrence, or they're not talking about it very clearly. So I find that really understanding some actual specific real life examples can be very helpful to cut through the clutter. So here are some of the reasons why you might want to talk about examples as a team. One, it helps build shared understanding. So you're definitely doing that as you're kind of working with the team to figure out, okay, here's how we're actually going to implement this story. But as I mentioned, it's also good for understanding what the heck you're talking about in the first place. The other thing that examples can be very helpful for is, and especially this particular technique, is to actually talk through what are some of the questions that we know folks are going to have as they start trying to make this thing happen. Again, as someone who has gone from writing extensively long requirement specs back in the day when I was a business analyst to trying to write a little bit more right-sized things now to actually testing it after the fact. One of the things I always found is that the more discussions you can have about various scenarios and various things you want to get clarified earlier on, the better. And the less likely you're going to have to keep going back and forth to try and say, well, that's not quite what I was meaning. The other nice thing about it is it gives, you can get a team a jump start on test planning and testing from the standpoint that you're actually doing this before any development happens. So hopefully most of you are in the experience now where you are doing that. But again, looking back on back in the day where we would wait to figure out, oh, okay, the thing's built now how are we going to test it? Kind of tends to slow things down. So if you're able to actually lay out, here's how we're going to confirm what it is we're actually building beforehand, that actually gives the folks building it something to target towards, and it usually makes things clearer for them. As I mentioned, you want to make sure that you're involving different perspectives so that you get a better result, and so that you can uncover some of those things that just a single person may not think about. You also can clarify and even identify what assumptions people might be working with to make sure that no one is making guesses and assumptions as they build or describe it. And finally, really talking through examples helps to clarify the business intent. What is it we're actually trying to accomplish with this that sometimes you only really understand when you get down to the very nitty-gritty details. So when you think about who should be involved in talking about examples, it's actually a fairly broad group. The usual suspects when it comes to this is what's known as the three amigos. So it's someone coming from the business perspective, or the person that's describing the problem. So, and they're thinking at it from is, have I accurately described the problem I want solved? You want someone coming from the perspective of how that's actually making it happen. And they're involved in the discussion to think about, do I have enough information to actually solve this problem? So, do I know all the specifics? And then we've got someone from a testing perspective that is great to kind of put in it's what happens when. So they're the folks that are always coming up with the scenarios and say, well, what about in this case? What's going to happen here that may not always be self-evident when you're just getting started out. So again, the sooner you can talk through those examples, and one, you can say, well, first of all, that particular scenario isn't likely to happen or won't happen, so we don't need to worry about that. Or you can have the discussions around, oh yeah, I can see what you're saying about that particular scenario. We should figure that out and talk about it now, as opposed to a developer getting down to having the 90% done and then spending the 90% of their time finishing that last 10% because you're coming up with all kinds of scenarios that you didn't think of before. So having these different perspectives can be very, very helpful. And then depending on the nature of what it is you're working on, you might have some other perspectives. So if it's a very heavily user interface intensive or very directly user interactive, you certainly want to have someone with the user experience kind of perspective involved in these discussions as well. Right now, the product I'm working on at the moment is actually extremely data intensive behind the scenes. So usually these different perspectives is pretty sufficient. But if you have someone that really has a really good understanding of the data you're dealing with, that can be helpful to have them involved as well. The next thing to think about is when should you have these conversations? And I mentioned before, I'm a big believer in wanting to pull those discussions up as early as possible. And the other thing I've learned over my course of time is that you often will have these discussions more than once. So as a means of doing this, I kind of want to describe my approach to backlog refinement. And again, I'm assuming folks are working in some form of Agile approaches here. And so the time to have those conversations is just in time. So when I go through the process of doing backlog refinement, I usually kind of lay out a process and actually have a board set up that I use to track where things are and as far as getting refined from a backlog standpoint. And so I usually have a certain point during that process where I say, well, we've collected enough information that it makes sense to gather a group of people together to talk through it in specific detail and have those discussions around examples. So what I'm showing here, and I'll show a little bit different picture of it, is what I refer to as a discovery board. Although as I get more into continuous discovery and things, I'm beginning to wonder if I should change the name of it. But basically what this is it's kind of detailing out different steps in your process of fleshing out a backlog item towards getting to a definition of ready. And somewhere in this point, usually between the sized and the ready to rock columns, in this example, is when I would most likely have the first discussion to flesh out what some examples might look like. And the reason I'm doing it there is because I've pulled together at least enough information to start off that conversation, so you're not starting from a blank slate, but enough information to kind of give a general description of what it is you're talking about. And then that discussion that you have to bring out examples, which we'll go into more detail here in a few minutes, really helps to kind of finally flesh out that backlog item and gives the rest of the team the confidence that, yep, we're ready to pick that up and start working on it. So as I mentioned, getting things ready to rock is a great time for these conversations. It also gives the folks that are going to implement it a chance to look at it and say, do we have enough information wrapped up into this thing to know that we can actually run with it and get it across the finish line in a timely fashion? I'm going to stop here for a second, see if anyone has any questions yet.
There hasn't been anything put in the chat yet.
All righty. That was also an excuse to give me a chance to drink. So how do we structure these conversations? There's a lot of different ways. You could just kind of leave it up and go willy-nilly, but one of the things that can be helpful is that if you have a particular approach you use to discuss different, especially different backlog items. And this is where the technique of example mapping comes in. Now, I'm going to walk through it and kind of going to describe how it happens. There's a link down here at the bottom where you can get more information about it. And at the end of my slides is a link where you can go and get a lot more additional information about the approach to example mapping. This particular technique is extremely helpful when you're working on something that has a lot of user interaction, that has several rules involved with kind of how things interact. After I kind of walk through this, I'm going to show you some things that I do if you're dealing with something that's a little bit more maybe data intensive that doesn't have as much user interaction. So this is a great technique, but there are going to be some cases where it's much more useful than others. So just kind of wanted to put that out there. So really the benefit of doing example mapping is it provides a way to structure your conversation to get to the point where you're getting everybody on the same page and building that shared understanding about what it is they're trying to do. And at the same time, you're able to identify or make sure you've clarified the rules or acceptance criteria you have for your backlog item. You may use this as an opportunity to say, this particular item that we're trying to tackle is too big. We got to split it down into smaller bits. It's a great way to identify, oh, we've got a bunch of questions that we need to go out and further clarify. It also gives people kind of a better understanding of where everyone else is coming from, because you're kind of hearing the different things that pop into their heads. So here's what an example map kind of looks like. You basically start with a backlog item, and it is helpful if you're doing this in person to get different colored index cards. So there is some meaning in the different colors just so you can separate things. Alternatively, if you're doing this virtually, you can use a Miro or Mural and do different colored cards that way as well. But you have different colors for different types of things. So yellow is your backlog item. So that's the story that you're trying to understand a bit more. Those blue boxes are your rules or your acceptance criteria. So the things you're saying, these are the things that we want to make sure are things we can confirm or make sure they're working in a certain way. Some of these rules are going to be complicated enough that it's helpful to further explain them with the use of examples. And some of the rules or some of the acceptance criteria are going to be so clear cut, you probably don't need to do that. So it's important to know that as you're going through this process, you don't have to create examples for everything as long as everyone says, yeah, yep, we get it, we understand it. The red are questions. So these are things that as you're discussing it, you may have a particular acceptance criteria. You can start talking through it and you say, you know what, we're not exactly sure how we want this to happen. We probably should go off and do a little bit more further investigation to clarify what it is we're trying to get done. So it's helpful to identify those things and note them so that you can have something to follow up on. So let's go through an example. This example is from my tried and true Agile Alliance conference submission system that I worked on a few years ago. And so the premise of this was it's the Agile Alliance, and they still are. And as far as I know, they are still using the submission system. But I've kind of stepped away from that. It's a method that they use. So they do an annual conference where it's a week-long thing, and they usually have about 250 sessions throughout the course of that week, because there's basically about 15 tracks they've got running concurrently. They get over 1,000 submissions and it needs some way to pare that down, but they want to do it in a way that's kind of community-based. So they have a mechanism where people submit conference ideas and a group of volunteers will review those conference presentation ideas, provide feedback, and then maybe give the presenter a chance to kind of refine their idea. And then eventually the chairs of the conference end up picking the sessions that they want to actually have as part of the schedule. So this particular functionality is giving people called reviewers the ability to actually provide reviews on conference presentation ideas that have been submitted. So our story is we're adding a review to our submission that's already been sent. So there are a couple of rules that are involved with this. One of it is that the people that are doing reviews are organized into different topic-based tracks. So one of those tracks is, I believe was at one point in time, I don't know if it still is one, is quality assurance and testing or something along those lines. So people that are kind of subject matter experts in quality assurance would be people that would be reviewing sessions submitted to that track. So premise here is that people can only submit reviews to sessions that were submitted to a particular track. They only can provide one review to a session, but they do have ways of following up with comments and things like that. This one should hopefully stand out pretty clear as far as why you wouldn't want someone reviewing their own session. It's kind of pointless, and then it could kind of skew the results. Let's see if there's any other rules. Nope, that one's it. So those are kind of the rules that are involved with adding a review. And as you're going through and clarifying these acceptance criteria, depending on the nature of what it is you're building, you might even at this point say, you know what, that seems like an awful lot of work to incorporate into one story. We might want to split it out, and the split might happen by saying we're going to take these couple of acceptance criteria and break them off into their own separate story. But for the sake of example, we're going to just kind of leave those all together here. So then as the team is talking through this, and it's a developer and the product person and the test and someone who's doing the testing, they say, so let's talk through this only review sessions in your own track. Let's kind of clarify that. What does that mean a little bit more? So we might want to add an example that says, this is the one where session is in Reed's track. So Reed is the persona for a reviewer. And so this is basically saying, in this one example we want to look at is that the session was actually submitted to Reed's track. You'll notice that the examples are named in a certain way, and this is known as the Friends naming convention, mirroring how every episode of Friends was named. It's the one where Ross did such and such or whatever. So these examples are named the one where da-da-da-da-da. Another key thing here is, and we'll talk a little bit in a couple of minutes about how you can actually provide the specifics around these examples. As you're doing this example mapping exercise, the main thing you're trying to do is just identify what examples you'll want to delve into deeper. You don't actually have to delve into the deep detail during this discussion. You might choose to do that after the fact, kind of circle back around, but you don't have to. Right now, you're just identifying what are some examples that would help clarify what these things are. So another one is they were talking about and say, well, on this review your own session, so we should certainly look where Reed is noted as the presenter. So what can happen during that particular thing? And I should stop here and also say that when you do go through and kind of identify these examples, this kind of gives you also a little bit of a chance to maybe talk through design. So the way that the submission system ended up being created in these cases is that if someone basically, if I, for example, was Reed and I submitted a session, the way that we were controlling that you can't review your own session is I just didn't see the button to actually create a review. So you may have those types of discussions here that says, oh, do we want to entice someone to think they can do it, but don't allow them, or how we want to do that? So that might also be part of this discussion as well. So as the discussion occurs, you also kind of come up with some scenarios that says, oh, gee, we haven't thought about that yet. So given these are our rules, well, what happens if the session changes tracks? So let's say that a session got submitted to the QA track and Reed says, okay, I'm going to go in and do a review. Now what happens if they say, oh, you know what, this wasn't really a QA related session. It was more of a product related session, and they switch tracks. Well, what happens with the review? What happens with Reed being able to go in it? All those kind of things. And the team here says, you know what, those are really good questions, but we don't know how we want to tackle those yet. So let's make a note to kind of go off on that. And it might be, we may handle that down the road. Then they go on and they say, okay, to really help clarify things, it's good to have examples that are kind of the happy path. And there are cases where, and there's other cases where you have like the negative path. So this should sound very familiar for people that do a lot of testing. It's really identifying what are all the different scenarios and what are all the different ways we can look at it to make sure that we're handling all the different scenarios. One, to make sure that we're clear on how it's going to work. And two, to make sure we can check to say, yep, we've got all the bases covered. So for example, on the review your own session, we're going to say, well, let's do one where Reed is the presenter. And then the submission system also had the case where they're the co-presenter. And that, of course, raises another question. Well, what happens if Reed reviews it and it gets added as a session co-presenter after the fact? And to my knowledge, I don't think that case has ever happened in the how many ever years that the submission system has been in place. But the basic premise here, as you can see, is that you get an opportunity to talk through, do we understand all of these rules? If not, let's kind of clarify them more with examples, or do we need to talk through how we might want to expect these things to be handled? The other beauty of this is that those boxes in green end up becoming your pointers to your actual test cases that you're going to have for when you actually build the thing and you need to go and test it. And where example mapping really is very helpful is they often become the cases that get automated by developers if you've got developers doing automated testing, building automated tests alongside as they're building functionality. You also notice that can only review, let me make sure it doesn't, yep. You also notice that the can only review a session once doesn't have any examples. In this particular case, the team said, you know what, we get that. We know that that makes sense, that you can only review a session once, so we don't need to have anything to clarify that at any stance. It makes total sense. So I'm going to stop there and see if any questions have come up, or if anyone has any questions.
They have not.
All righty. So as I've pointed out, the idea here is that we have this conversation. We clarify a lot of things. If we're in person, we're writing on cards. If we're doing this virtually, we're doing it on a mural board. And on the mural board, the nice thing about that now is that you do actually have something that persists. But if you're doing it, if you're doing it in real life, how do you go about remembering what it is you said? Because not only have you identified examples and acceptance criteria, but you've probably had some also very meaningful discussion along the way and clarified a lot of questions that people might have. So I want to kind of go through some things that you can do to supplement that discussion to keep track of agreements you made and make sure that everyone stays on that shared understanding that you built during this discussion. One of the things that I really find helpful, especially talking about backlog items that have a lot of user interaction, is the more modeling you can do, the more prototypes you can sketch out, the more process flows you can build, the better off you are. So this is truly a case where a picture can be worth 1,000 words or more. And a lot of times, if I haven't had the opportunity to kind of sketch one of these up beforehand, part of that example mapping discussion might even be talking through and sketching out a user interface prototype if it's a user interface type of a change. And to the point where you can do that again also with sticky notes. And again, a lot of this was kind of pre everyone going virtual, but this is also stuff you can do with Mural or Miro, doing things such as process flows, UI prototypes, or even report mockups. My favorite tool for doing report mockups is an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll see some other examples of that here coming up. But again, kind of laying out what pieces of information you're collecting in the case of a UI prototype or displaying in the case of a report mockup, or talking through the actual process of how it's going to happen, can also help clarify a ton before people start diving in and start trying to build things. And in a lot of cases, you'll find that these models tend to be things that might stretch across multiple backlog items. So multiple backlog items might refer to this and implement parts of the overall picture. Of course, you've got acceptance criteria. And so I kind of view acceptance criteria as a way of describing in general English the rules that are applied, or things that you can't convey either with a picture or with the examples that we'll look to here. So in this case, it's basically a set of rules, that all of the rules that could actually apply to reviewing a session. Now, when you have a backlog item that has this many acceptance criteria associated with it, unless you're making some very distinct design choices that are going to just prohibit some of these from the get-go, this is definitely a candidate that you could split down into smaller bits. And then finally, you have examples. So where example mapping originally came from, the guys that created it are kind of big believers in the behavior-driven development school of development, where they're actually talking through their particular backlog items ahead of time. And they also like to use this format, which is known as Gherkin, to describe behavior. And this is especially helpful if you're, again, working in something that has a lot of user interaction. Gherkin also gives you a great start towards using automated acceptance testing tools such as Cucumber, which are actually built to automate tests that are written in this formulation. So the way these are set up is basically you identify a precondition, you identify some action that occurs, and then you identify the result that happens. So when you do the example mapping, you're just identifying what are the different scenarios we want to check. Then as you're ready to deep dive into what those examples are, this is where you might use something such as Gherkin to spec those particular things out. The other approach for examples is the route of going with kind of doing something like a decision table, where this is especially helpful for calculations that have a set of inputs and an expected output, or if you're kind of working with data. And so that what you do here is you mock up data in spreadsheets. And in this particular case, you're doing a thing where each of the rows is a different scenario that happens. And in this particular case, what's going on here is that we have some rule in place for calculating an overall evaluation. And so we're using different scenarios to test out the logic to make sure it works. So basically these are, and in this case, what you would actually do is say, let's walk through all the different scenarios that might happen and say what the evaluation would be, just to make sure that we understand what the logic is and that we haven't missed any big potential scenarios that we need to account for in our logic. So again, different ways have, or different scenarios and different ways of formulating your examples work better for different types of products. This is much better for checking out business logic and business rules, whereas this formulation is much better for something that has a lot of interaction between a user and a system. And I wanted to supplement this with some explanation of some real life examples. So right now, what I'm working on is a database-driven effort to provide, basically pull together product information from two different sources and combine them together. And so one of the things we're faced with is trying to figure out, how do we make sure that we have a appropriate version history of the relationship between a parent record, which is basically, think of that as a product, and its child records, which might be a particular product might have different pricing offers depending on the quantity that are purchased, or they might have different what are known as digital assets, so pictures about it, or they might have different attributes. And so how do we make sure we're properly maintaining the version history between the parent and the different children? And so this is an example of a spreadsheet I put together to describe a particular versioning scheme that we were going to try out. And I basically did this to aid the conversation and talking through, okay, we've got a couple of different ways that we could do this versioning. So you'll notice down at the bottom, the tab says add new children and updates. We actually wanted to talk through two different ways of doing this. So I actually laid out examples that we could use as a conversation piece to talk through, to say, first of all, does everybody understand what approach we're talking about using? And then which one do we think will work best? So in some cases, those examples, it's great to do that as part of a discussion that you have with the team to make sure you've got a full understanding. And sometimes it's actually setting out different examples is a great way to help explain what it is you're looking for in the very beginning. So this one was a particular way of saying, here's a versioning approach that we'd like to use. Another example that I did is basically say, this one is we're formulating a specific unique identifier inside the system. And we needed to talk about, well, if we've just got one source system, that's pretty straightforward. If we get another source system in here, but if the UPC is the same, this is how we would expect things to happen. So this was another example that I used. And again, you'll notice that I'm using my favorite prototyping tool of an Excel spreadsheet, which is great if you're doing any kind of data intensive work. And then a third real life example is talking through how do we handle, because we're basically getting updates from two different systems and we're combining them together. How does that end up resulting on the final ultimate source system or ultimate system that we're looking at? How do we track those particular updates and things of that nature? So this, again, is just a way of saying, let's talk through different examples and say, here's what we would expect the results to be in each of those cases. So with that, kind of give you an overview of how examples work. And now want to see if anyone has any questions, follow-up questions or anything, or has any thoughts or have actually used some of these techniques before.
There aren't any questions, but I've actually done something similar to that in the past. It's been several years ago that we used a similar process for laying out our iterations and stuff and what we were going to work on. And it was very handy. And you could, like, we actually did it on a wall, so we would leave it up there. We'd leave it up there the whole time and move things around and tear things up and all that stuff. I don't see anybody asking any questions.
I'll jump in, Mike. Most of the teams I've been on have done some sort of product backlog refinement periodically, maybe twice a week. So I assume that you'd want to set up like example mapping sessions outside of that refinement meeting. So you're doing your refinement, you're kind of breaking it down, you're doing your sizing. So you'd still want to set up separate meetings, kind of pick up individual things and go to example mapping and setting up some examples then.
Yeah, and this, I was intending to talk a little bit more about this earlier. So yeah, the way we've got it working right now, and the way I've done it with a couple of teams is we're running in 2-week sprints, and on the week that we don't have like the planning ceremonies and things of that nature, we have a specific backlog refinement time. So I queue up a few items that I'm intending to come into the next sprint. And during that backlog refinement time, we'll kind of go in and do the deep dive, either if it's one of those things that I felt like I needed to put the examples together ahead of time to help explain things, or if we actually talk through those examples during that discussion, we'll do that. During that backlog refinement, that's also, we'll go through, discuss that, make sure everyone kind of understands what the item is. That's also when we do sizing for those things as well, so that the team has a pretty good handle on that. But we also find that then when we bring those items in to sprint planning, there will often be times where we will revisit or have further discussions clarifying those examples. Because one of the things I found is that teams sometimes pay a little bit more attention to stuff when they're actually working on them versus when I might be working on that in a week or two, right? So there are times where we have a couple of different discussions kind of going through that example mapping. One, kind of leading up to it to just get everyone familiar with it. And two, after the folks on the team have had a bit more time to think about it and have actually deeply looked into it, and they come up with some additional questions or things, that's also a good idea to revisit those discussions at that point and say, oh, yeah, this is what we were talking about.
There's a question coming right here. My audio failing me, but I found this to be really useful when you have one of your 3 amigos that's weak on the subject, like they're new to the business area or haven't been in the system, helps them understand considerations and be able to contribute. Yeah, that's a good point, Deanna.
Yep. So sometimes what you'll do there is there's a couple of different routes you can take for that one. One you might say is, just because it's the 3 amigos, you can have more than 3 people involved in the discussions. So especially if it's someone that's weak in the subject matter, you might say, oh, maybe we can incorporate someone else in there that's a little bit more familiar with it to get the other person up to speed, to get them up and running. Or the other thing you might find is that as you're starting off, you might generate a lot more questions. So the red cards might generate a lot more of those, where someone has to go off and check and do a little bit more research. Which then, if you sense that that's going to happen, you might say, you know what, we might want to have these discussions a little bit further ahead of when we would generally, just to give chance for have the discussion to even get an understanding of what questions we need to tackle, and then go off and get those answers and then come back and do it. So either that, or I would say is it might be helpful to bring in some additional people that might have a little bit more knowledge if they are available, to help get that other person up to speed. The other thing with it is that just because you have people that are there to intentionally represent specific perspectives, it doesn't mean that other folks can't bring up the, well, what happens in this scenario type questions or things of that nature. It's just, you're wanting to improve the chance that you're having it, people look at it from different viewpoints.
Yeah, like the fact that you say that, because I know, like when we do our 3 Amigos, sometimes we'll have like 2 testers come in, and it, kind of gives you, maybe one person thinks in one way, and so, just throws up some more questions, gets a better feel for what's going on. Maybe one person thinks about something that you're not thinking of right off the top, so it gives you a lot of bit more options right at the beginning and things to discuss and figure out.
As you're coming up with examples, how do you filter out some of the examples? Because sometimes it's really easy to come up with way too many. Do you do any kind of like, risk analysis to say, which ones are going to be most impactful or most valuable to the greatest population?
Yeah. So none of these are of that nature. Well, here in this case, for example, when I'm doing the decision table type approach, I'll start off by actually saying, if we've got, in this particular case, there's like 5 evaluations that are coming in. If I wanted to be extreme, I initially think about, okay, now it is possible that you could have how many ever permutations with each evaluation being one of 3 values. They didn't provide one, they agree or disagree across all 5, and my math is failing me at the moment, but you could generate that many things. And so if there's a few variables, I'll actually do that real quick just to think through and see, is there going to be anything that really drives any differences? Or I'm going to say, you know what, there's really no difference between if one person doesn't provide a response or 4 people don't provide a response. So we can cut it down that way. So there's from those cases when you have a lot of different potential data inputs and everything, you want to think through what are all the different permutations there, and are there any combinations of those permutations that just can't happen. When you're talking more examples of this nature where it's more interactive, you want to think about, again, this is another case where it says if we start getting a lot of different examples that we're identifying, even just as the green cards, that can be another case that says, you know what, there's a lot of things that could happen here. We probably shouldn't try and tackle all of these right now. So let's split some of those off and talk about them later. The third thing to think about with this is that when I've worked with teams that start doing this, they do generate a lot of examples. And then one of the things they start getting freaked out about is that, do we actually have to create tests for all of these things? And just like you have with kind of risk-based testing and everything, you got to put some sense to it that says, okay, what are the cases that are most likely to happen? What are the cases that are going to have the biggest impact? We definitely want to check those things out, but we don't have to check every single little variation on something, which it really comes the case if you're dealing with any kind of logic that has to deal with numbers. So if you basically say we've got, let's say it's price. If the price is above $5, you do one thing. If it's below $5, you do another thing. That doesn't mean you have to do every cent increment from $0 to $10. You could basically say if the price is as $1, let's test that. Let's check it if the price is $4.99. Let's check it if the price is $5. Let's check it if the price is $5.01, and then some bigger number above that. And you can be fairly comfortable that if you cover that range, you've got things covered. So it's a matter of balancing that we're hitting all of the main cases, either from likelihood or from impact, that if they happen, we don't want to be testing this thing until next year. Or we don't want to be talking through the examples for next year. And another way of doing that is that if you come up with a couple of examples and you realize the result is the same, then it's like, okay, chances are there's a lot of these cases that are probably going to be that way. So what are the things that when they change, the end resulting behavior changes as well. And let's check those different switches.
I don't see any other questions, Kat. So.
All right. Well, I am going to wrap things up here real quick. And if anyone thinks of any other questions, we can tackle those with a couple minutes we have left. So the key things to come out of this with is there is a great amount of value in discussing examples as a way of making sure that everyone's has the same page and has that shared understanding about what it is you're trying to do. A good time to discuss examples is when you're getting the stories ready. You want to involve multiple perspectives when you're doing it, and you want to find additional ways of kind of describing what that backlog item is all about, other than just the as a I want so that bit of it. And if you would like any additional information, that link down there at the bottom will get you a copy of the presentation. It doesn't have the real life examples in there. I showed those today, but didn't want to memorialize them in slides ongoing. And it also has links to a bunch of other resources. And if you have any questions, there's my email address and my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions.
Mike's talking, but he's on mute.
I am talking, but I'm on mute. I was saying, yeah, it is being recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel. All right. Well, with that, Kent, thank you very much for your presentation today. Thank everybody for attending. Again, this will get posted out to our YouTube channel. And watch for information on the social gathering that we're going to have next month. And with that, everybody have a good day. Try not to roast to death, because I've been outside a couple of times and it's very hot out. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Cap.
Thanks.